Please join me in giving Tim Witsman a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
This all started in the spring at Wichita Downtown Rotary. They had a gentleman named Peter Zeihan speak, and he's a geopolitical strategist. Used to work for George Friedman, who some of you may have looked at some of his stuff. Geopolitical strategists look at geography, climate, demographics and things to sort of predict how countries will behave. And they get paid kind of like the old seers of ancient times who'd read the entrails of birds. Well, that's what they're doing, except using data to predict what's going to happen in the next several years. And they make a lot of money doing that. So I turned John onto it, and John said, oh, I'd like to have him check out how much will it cost. So I did $20,000. John thought that was above the budget. So he said, well, Tim, if you'll do it, we'll just take one number out. And I said, cool. Sounds great to me. He took the 2 out. You know John. So I did get to keep the 4 zeros and the comma. So that was all right. So anyway, I'm not a person who sort of becomes an acolyte of anything. When I saw Zeihan, I thought this was the best presentation I'd ever seen, not because of agreeing with him on stuff, but because the data was so good. I mean, this was factual stuff. So I started researching and reading. I read his books. He has 2 out. And I want to give him the credit because most of these slides are from Zeihan. And it's apparently allowed. They're on the net. But I wanted to give that credit. Those are his 2 books. He has a 3rd one that'll be coming out soon. And I think they're well worth it. They're the best things I've seen on where the world is and where it's headed for a while. Okay, I'm going to take you back. I've got to move really fast. I hope I finish by 1, and if so, then I'll take questions after, and I know some of you have to leave. 1944, July 1st, the Americans called their allies together at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. And the countries coming there knew that the United States was going to tell them the way the cookie crumbled. It was going to be, how are things going to be? How are things going to operate? And they're worried about that, obviously. So the Americans pull them in and say, okay, here's the deal. There'll be something to sign when we're through. 1, you're going to peg your money to the dollar and the gold standard. Everybody who signs on this, that's the deal. 2, we're going to give you access to our markets, and we're going to protect the oceans. And they're kind of, really? You do that? So everybody signed except for the Soviet Union. Make sense? There were 44 countries that signed. Now, how could the U.S. do that? Well, first, we had 2/3 of the gold in the world. Everybody else had to give us their gold to get munitions and whatever. And we stayed on that gold standard until Nixon took us off in 1971. At that point, the US dollar becomes the reserve currency for the world. Other countries joined later. The original members are that fourth down countries, and then these others, some joined later and some never did. But this was about the Cold War, obviously. What these countries got was the biggest market they'd ever seen. The United States GDP, gross domestic product, was equal to somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the world's at the time. Okay? Do you know what it is today? Almost 25%. Almost no change in proportion. So indirectly, we subsidized every one of the allies. Part of what mattered was shipping. 3/4 of the world's trade goes by ship. Okay? A container ship costs about 17 cents per container mile. Rail costs 60 cents, trucks cost $2.40 per container mile. That's hugely significant because it means you can move an awful lot of stuff very cheaply. Trump is absolutely correct. We paid. Now, we didn't do it because we were sweet and wonderful. We did it, it was a bribe, in essence, for people to be on our side. All right? That was the deal. And it played out that it was against the Soviet Union. So we didn't do it to get rich. It was a tool. And it was a tool against Soviet expansion. At the end of World War II, the United States Navy was equal to all the navies of the world combined. Today, Zeihan says it is still equal to all the navies of the world combined. There are arguments about who's next on this. Zeihan says it's Japan second and Britain next. And the reason he says that is those are navies that are called blue water navies. They can project power. Japanese is supposed to be only for defense. They have carriers that are for helicopters, but they can be modified to carry jets. Okay? Others will list Russia and China as second and third. Russia has a big fleet, and it's impressive, except a lot of it's rotten. It hasn't been maintained through this post-Soviet era. China is building, and building fast. They're building a carrier. They have 13 nuclear submarines already, but they want submarines in a different way than the Germans did. When the Germans had them, they wanted them to sink ships carrying supplies to England. The Japanese would use them to keep people away from the coast. That make any sense to you? Different purpose. Okay, so when World War II ends, the US GDP was more than Britain, France, Italy, Russia, Germany, Austria, and Japan combined. We're the only game in town, folks. What younger people don't understand is in World War II, the Germans couldn't fight a two-front war. They lost it. The United States fought a two-front war on different continents and supplied all the other allies as well. Stalin was asked after World War II, what won the war? His answer, the Ford truck. The Germans were moving their stuff with horses, and Stalin had Studebakers and Dodges, actually. He just called everything a Ford, because if it was American and it was capitalist, it was Ford. So, okay. One of the things that's happened with containers is we've also brought the cost of shipping down. The cost of sea freight by 2005 was only 22% of what it used to be in 1930. That's rather consequential. And the world GDP has grown 10 times since the end of World War II. Now, the United States Navy, could you take out one of our supercarriers? Yeah, you could, with missiles, et cetera. And that's another thing the Chinese are doing. It's mostly submarines and missiles. But the trouble is, the last two countries who did that in World War II got to engage in complete urban renewal. So it's not advisable. And when we talk about size, I checked, and the United States tonnage is an old way they used to do it. That doesn't really get the nuances of modern technology. But you'd have to add the next 9 navies to equal ours in tonnage. A U.S. supercarrier would rank 16th in the world in tonnage, and we have 10 of them. And nobody else has any. All right? So who benefited the most out of all this? You'll be surprised. China. We'd gone from a colonial period where countries would grab on to places to get supplies, to bring them in, to produce them, the same way Britain treated us when we were a colony. Any of you, none of you were around then, were you? Okay. But we'd gone from that, and that had been obliterated by World War II. The United States was the cop for the world, essentially. I'm going to move to the U.S. Okay. Land quality. If you see in here, and some of that goes up into Canada, that's the greatest land you can find, folks. You ought to get up every morning and kiss the ground. I mean, I grew up in Indiana, northern Indiana, the black loam 18 inches deep. You can't find that stuff. I mean, so this area produces more food than the next two in the world combined. That means that we have an ability to ship things rather cheaply with the water, but we also have this fantastic land. This is the world, and there are only a few places where there's really good land. Down here in Argentina, Paraguay, a little bit of Brazil, Uruguay. That's the Pampas down there. And the North European plain, which runs, France, Germany, Poland, across through there, and then gets bigger as it goes to the east. And a little strip down here in Australia. I won't try to find them all. China has a piece too. Okay? Not very many places where you have temperate climates. The problem with the tropical is diseases. And a lot of that land is very acidic, and you can't grow the kinds of crops that we grow. Let me stay on the water bit for a moment. The United States has more, within our country, more navigable water on rivers than the rest of the world combined. That isn't as important as it used to be. In the 19th century, think of a farmer. In the US, you could move stuff to a river pretty easily. Nobody was that far away from a river. That whole Mississippi system you can get to, and you can move product cheaply. We have more port potential. We haven't used all of it, but we have more port potential than the rest of the world combined. It just, in places like Africa, there aren't very many good ports. Just aren't, the way the land is laid out. But we have it. Today, only about 5.5% of our trade, or our product here internally, moves by water. So Zeihan kind of overemphasizes that. But what it does is it holds down the price of trucking and other things because it's an alternative. If the other prices get too high, you can use water. And we have these incredible barrier islands. Most folks don't have that either. The barrier islands allow us to have the intracoastal waterway that runs from up in New England all the way down in the Gulf. We also have the largest capital base. No one can compete with us on that. And then I want to talk about demography. And this is perhaps the most important thing. Down here we have the Gen Y, okay? Up here the Gen Xers, and then the boomers here. Everybody talks about the boomer retirement, which is hugely important. These would also be called millennials, and a lot of people want to throw stones at millennials. But here's the deal. We're the only developed country that has them. Nobody else has got any. What goes on is these people from 20 to early 40s, regardless of the generation, they're the consumers. They're the people going in debt. They're the people at Target and Walmart buying the stuff. The people from the early 40s up to 65 are the investors. They're putting money aside. That's where the money to create companies comes from, all right? And then the folks past 65, folks like me, we just take. We don't give anything. Well, you need these different groups. And while this is not an ideal shape, we at least have some. Now, when the millennials get into the 40 to 65, it's going to be tougher for investment because you won't have as many people, you won't have as much money, which will chase the cost of that up. All right? Let me give you the rest of the world without the US. No, I'm sorry, this is us in 2030. I've just advanced the time. And you can see it's not terrible, it's not perfectly desirable too. This is the rest of the developed world. Do you see any problems? Ain't enough young people. Not enough consumers there, okay? And a lot of people getting older. Who's going to pay for them? Let me give you a place like Italy. In Italy, Social Security right now is double ours. They'd have to double it again. Can you imagine a young person paying a third of their income? It's crazy. The other thing that matters so much along with this is, where does financing come from? In the United States, over half the financing of business comes from stock. Add in bonds, and you're at about 70%. No other country does that. It's banks. In Europe, it's 70% from banks, and I'm going to show you why that's a weakness in a moment. American banks are different from banks in Europe. American banks were created to service economic needs. Banks in Europe, there's always state involvement, sometimes state-owned, and they're to advance national interests. That's different. You give loans for different reasons, okay? So ours are not geopolitical in their thinking. They're more measured. And a lot of the loans you find around the world wouldn't be made by an American banker. The consequence of us having the land, the low cost, having millennials, having an internal market, I mean, this is the biggest internal market the world had ever seen, is that we are now a global power, but we're beginning to have fewer global interests. And I can't finish that off until later in this, and I'll show you how that works. In terms of trade, it's hard to talk about you can get two different people say things and you'll think that they're disagreeing with each other. The United States has not been a big export country. When I was graduated from college, imports, exports were 5% of the US economy. 5%, it's not that much. Today, our exports are 12%, our imports are about 17. Okay, we've got an imbalance on that. That's still not huge, but what Zeihan and some of the others miss is that we talk about China, which is the biggest exporter. China is much bigger than ours, but they're going down as a percent of their GDP. Ours are going up as a percent of GDP. So we're headed in two different directions. The largest exporter in the world is China. Second is the United States, even though it's a small piece of our economy. Germany, it's 45% of their economy. So you can look at it, is it small, is it large? From an American viewpoint, it's not as big a number. From a world viewpoint, it's big, okay? That's where people sometimes get into arguments because they don't understand it. Where do we ship our stuff? A third goes to North America. Half goes to the Western Hemisphere. So most of our trade, or a good deal of our trade, is really pretty close to home. Canada-US trade is the largest bilateral trade ever in the history of the world. We ship incredible amounts to each other. Now I'm going to go to Europe and see some of the issues and problems they have. That's European demography. It looks kind of like that world one, doesn't it? There ain't any kids. And you're going to hear worse than that for some other places. But not enough young people. That's Italy, who I was talking about. You can see why they would end up having to have more. Okay, Europe went to the euro. And I have to admit to you that I had a great interest in all that. When I wrote my master's thesis, it was on the European community, European economic community at that time. But what's happened has really changed things greatly. Going to the euro allowed money to flow from the rich countries like Germany to the poorer countries that are mostly Southern Europe, then Central Europe as they came in. But that created a mess. And the mess is that they're not as able to do things as the Germans, and they can't devalue. The normal thing you do, if you're having an imbalance, like Germany's exporting everything and you can't get anything out, what do? You devalue your money. You make it cheaper for people to buy your stuff. Make it more expensive for your people to buy anything from somewhere else, okay? If you're all in the euro, you can't do that. And Germany calls the game. Germany has incredible number of regulations. That's the way Germans do things. And you have the banking that's still, even with a common currency, you've got banking by all the different countries, 28 different countries. So that finance is state, not market directed. And the states guarantee loans. But the problem is you get into a difficulty with the kinds of loans and the amount. In the United States, in 2008, liquidity loans amounted to about 1.3%, okay? In Europe, in 2017, excuse me, it was 2017 for us, also for Europe, it's about $900 billion. In Greece, it's 43% of the loans are liquidity loans. In Ireland, 21%. And the eastern countries, you know, the Czech republics, et cetera, it's in the teens. So an awful lot of liquidity loans. I mean, money that you need just to stay afloat. Non-performing loans are huge, almost $1 trillion. And in Europe, there's $2 trillion in euro debt every year that's maturing. Now, they've had some messes. You remember Ireland going through the crisis, Iceland going through the crisis, Greece, et cetera. Another thing to consider is government debt. In the U.S., the last numbers I had were it was about 105% of GDP. A place like Greece, it's 189%. Some countries are actually lower, France, UK, Germany, and Spain, for example. But let's talk about the Germans for a moment. They're fascinating. We're not like them, by the way, even though I'm largely German stock, but that doesn't matter. We're not like them. They plan everything. 1840, the Germans do not have a country, but they are planning a rail system to connect the major centers and also to get troops back and forth across east and west. The United States is discussing a second road. National road, okay? I mean, other things had been built, but a national road. We don't plan like that. This really struck me when I was studying educational things. I was looking at Germany, and I saw 83% of the people in Germany got either a college degree, an associate, or a certificate. 83%. I thought, well, that's interesting. This was back when Americans were saying, 100% of our kids will be the best. I'm thinking, have you ever seen a bell-shaped curve? So that 83 fascinated me. I thought, 83%. Think of the bell-shaped curve. Let's see, 2/3 of the people are between 90 and 110 IQ. That leaves 33.33%. Half of that is 17. So what does that mean? That means the only people that are not getting at least a certificate have an IQ below 90. It means the Germans are educating everybody it's possible to educate to that level. Doesn't mean somebody below 90 can't work, but they're not going to be a plumber. They're not going to be an electrician. Do you see? So the Germans, partly because of their position, they've had to be better in many ways. And so they work really hard at that. 32% of their exports require the sea lanes. So a third of their exports. And remember, exports are 45% of their whole economy. Now I'm going to turn to Russia. Oh, Russia is always a sad case. In 1939, Russia had about 21 million people more than we had. Today, do you know what the Russian percentage is compared to us? They are 45% of our population. About 2 million have left Russia, and their GDP is 1/15 ours. And I will predict to you that between 2030 and 2050, Mexico will pass Russia. Some people think it's nearer to 2050. I think it'll be faster than that. It's a sad case in that Russian mortality is terrible. Do you know what the average death age for a man is in Russia? 59. You know, what is it for us? 76? Somewhere in that area.
Almost all alcoholism too.
It's alcoholism, TB is terrible. I mean, it goes on and on. But the problem for Russia is they just don't have, let me see, did I miss one? I want to advance. Nope. I don't have one on the Russian demographics, but let me talk some more about that. There aren't enough Russian young people to support a population half its current size. And many of them would like to leave. The problem is they can't leave because they don't have any skills the West can use. Their whole training system had fallen apart. They do have oil and gas. But let me explain the Russian paranoia for a moment. And they are paranoid. But even paranoids have real enemies. Got to remember, the Russians were invaded by Gustavus Adolphus and the Swedes, by Napoleon, by Hitler. They've been invaded over and over. They lost 26 million people in World War II. Do you know what that equals? I went back and looked at the populations of American states. Start with this. North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Idaho, Montana, Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, and Mississippi.
Wow.
That's what the Russians lost in World War II. So can somebody manipulate them and, you know, get them exercise that somebody's coming after? Heck yes. If you lost all the people in the middle of the United States, and the Russian leadership is something very interesting. When in the late 1960s, early 70s, I knew some people who were in diplomacy and also intelligence and had served in Russia. And so I asked them, tell me about the Russian leaders. And they looked at each other, thought about it, and one guy said, think mafia. And it made sense. I mean, it really did. That's the way you get to the top. And then some of you may have been at a chamber annual meeting where Condoleezza Rice spoke. Some of you there. And they asked Condi to describe Putin. And when she gave her answer, I knew she was never going back into government. She said, he's a thug. And he liked her because she spoke Russian, she was a Russianist, and they had a good relationship. But when she said that, I thought, that woman's not going back into government. She wouldn't have said that if she were. Okay, this is the issue with the Russians then. If you're paranoid and you think everybody's after you, they have this long border, 3,000 miles long. The border they'd like to have is the one when they cut the deal with Hitler in 1939, and that is to move the border to about the middle of Poland. My hands are too shaky, sorry folks. But that means they've got to take Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Romania and some other countries. Well, they've been fiddling around with Ukraine and trying to find out what somebody would do. Will the Europeans react? Haven't so far. The Europeans probably couldn't be successful unless we came in. If you add up all the European armed forces, they are just the same size as Russia's. But Russia would be a unified command. God knows what you'd have with 40 countries maybe. So that's what they'd like to do, because that plain, that northern European plain we talked about, that narrows to about 300 miles if you can get yourself into the middle of Poland. And then you've got Carpathian Mountains, you've got other things you can defend. But they badly want that. How far, and the thing for Russia is, see, this is a real time-sensitive deal. In 5 years, he ain't got no kids. Who's going in the army? So if he's going to do something, you might want to do it now. We don't know what the U.S. is going to do. I find it, I can't figure out exactly. We've done some things that are pretty strong. We have pre-positioned a lot of stuff and sold things to the Poles. Love the Poles. By the way, the Poles represent us in other parts of the world where we don't have an embassy. They're our buddies. And in Romania. Romania is right below the Ukraine. And so those are pretty strong moves. At the same time, you know, Trump has said he's not sure he'd go to war for something in Eastern Europe. But I don't know. We'll find out. I don't think that the Scandinavians and the Brits would ever let Russia take back the Baltic countries. I think they would go to war, and at the very least we'd supply everybody and all that kind of stuff and give them intelligence. Germany now doesn't have an army. They got 62,000 people. Doesn't mean anything. The Russians have a huge edge in planes. If they got into a conflict with any of these folks, they'd probably lose their navy. But plane-wise, they'd be pretty strong. Not sure they could actually accomplish all that they would want to accomplish. All right, I'm going to shift for a second and talk about growth. And how do you get yourself to grow? Well, for GDP, there are only two things that matter. It's population productivity. Policy-wise, you can go for consumption-led growth, investment-led growth, or export-led growth. Only ways to do it. Consumption means you got to have a whole bunch of people. That's what we've had. We have had an enormous ability to absorb and buy things. Investment-led growth means you need a bunch of people there who have some money. That's what we had with the boomers. The problem is when you have too many of those, then you get bubbles. You start chasing rates. And you know, the good deals have already been taken, so you start looking at the not so good deals to get a higher rate. When I worked in financial services, people would want to buy GM bonds. No. And I lost customers because I said, I won't do it. It's bad stuff. You know, what happened? They lost every penny. Export-led is what a lot of countries have done. And the only reason they've been able to do that is the United States. Because the United States is protecting those sea lanes, et cetera. So we're going to move to China. Their demographics. That's the product of one-child policy. That's been changed, but the trouble with demographics is you may not like it, but it takes you 60 years to change it. Now, there are countries even talking about in vitro fertilization, trying to up their birth rates. But that's what the Chinese have, and that is not a pretty sight for the future. In finance, they do things differently than we do. We invest to make money. They invest to create jobs. Whether or not it makes money. When I was in China, I talked to a Taiwanese owner of factories in Shanghai. And he told me first, this was some time ago, I think it's changed, but he told me that most of the factories in Shanghai were actually owned by Taiwan. But They had to do what the Chinese authorities wanted. And what the Chinese authorities wanted was for him to run a second shift. He didn't need a second shift, but he had to run a second shift. So you've got a whole lot of companies, particularly the state-owned enterprises. It's similar to what Russia was like. When Pizza Hut went to Russia, they had to do several things. They were putting up their first Pizza Hut in Moscow. They had to hire the Russian army to protect the potatoes. You can call that a bribe, if you would like. The second was they needed a warehouse. And the Russians took them out to this warehouse, and it was full of front-end loaders. And the Americans said, yeah, that's fine, the warehouse will work. What are you going to do with the front-end loaders? And they said, oh, they met quota, they just don't work. That's the problem with state-owned enterprises. The purpose is to keep somebody employed, not to produce something anybody would want to buy. Okay, Chinese banks. The best estimate of non-performing loans, I didn't even talk about that in Europe, but I probably should have. They have a much looser standard on what's a non-performing loan. If a bank gets, what is the number now, 5-6%? We close a bank down. Europeans, most of those countries are way above that, way, way above that. And the Chinese, it's maybe 15 to 19%, okay? There's a shadow economy too. It's very hard to deal with the Chinese numbers. I see different estimates. I don't just take what Zeihan says. I look up this stuff all over the place, and you get wildly different numbers. They have a shadow economy that's maybe 15-20% of the economy. Illegal hedge funds, loan sharks, all kinds of stuff that makes it tough to know. And in 2009, their money supply was double what ours is, with a economy that was half our size. You print money, and you throw it in there to keep people working. Their big problem has to do with different parts of the country. Along the coast, those folks are Western. I mean, they've been, in a sense, you can think of them as colonies, because they've always been part of the Western, or at least since China was opened. But north, you get Beijing, and that's different. That's the political power. That's the Han. But what's occurred, even though the Chinese don't like it, is that the dollar has become the reserve currency. It's the only store of value. This is a quote from 2009. The Director General of the Chinese Bank, they're the review people over the banks. I'm trying to remember the acronym now. I can't get it. Here's his quote. Except for U.S. treasuries, what can you hold? Gold? You don't want to hold Japanese government bonds or UK bonds. U.S. treasuries are the safe haven. For everyone, including China, it is the only option. We hate you guys. Once you start issuing 1 to 2 trillion in new debt, we know the dollar's going to depreciate, meaning their money goes down. So we hate you guys. But there's nothing much we can do. Now, the Chinese are hopeful that they can make their yuan, the renminbi, stronger than it is and make it an alternative to the dollar. At one point, the EU was created to be an alternative to the dollar. That ain't happening. The EU is in deep, deep trouble. And one of the few things that's good for Britain right now is they're not in the EU, because the Brexit is a killer for them, absolute killer. One of the things they have to do, well, I'll get to that later. I'll leave that alone for a moment.
Don't forget, that's an interesting thing.
By 2015, more Chinese money was flowing to the U.S. than U.S. to China. That was odd. What's going on? Rich Chinese want to put their money where it makes money, where its purpose isn't just to provide a job. That's what Xi means by corruption. That's what the corruption deal was all about. There was an enormous spike in Chinese investment in the U.S. They also invest in Australia, New Zealand. I mean, in New Zealand, it's now like the West Coast. You know, my modest house, I paid $143,000 for it, it'd be worth $1 million. They don't sell houses in New Zealand by the way we do it. I'm selling my mother's house today, and some roof things came off in a storm yesterday. It's a mess. I'm not going to talk about that part. But in New Zealand, it's auction. You sell a house by an auction. So there is a flight of that money, and what Xi's trying to do is make them keep that money in the country. So that's when they say corruption, you know, we think of something else. They're talking about people taking their money and getting it out of Dodge and putting it someplace where it's safer and can make more money. 3/4 of the deposits are in 4 large state-owned banks, the Agricultural Bank of China, the Construction Bank, the Industrial Bank, and the Commercial Bank. And what they had for a long time was cheap labor and cheap credit. But the labor ain't so cheap anymore. From 2002 to 2014, labor costs grew by 6 times, while Mexico's grew by about 1 1/4. So they subsidize the prices of finished products, they subsidize the consumption for inputs, and there's a collusion of banks and local officials that produces large but not efficient companies, in essence, too big to fail. Now the Chinese do, and they are going through in the north, closing some of those state enterprises, but that means people out of work. So what they do is they take money from the coast, the Singapores, the Hong Kongs, where the money's made, and that's used elsewhere to try to keep the peace. Because China is not naturally an adhesive thing. A lot of different ethnicities, there are all kinds of reasons why these people might not hold together. And then after the global financial crisis, the lending is tripled. So their financing is now at $5 trillion in an economy of $8 trillion, and their new lending is 7 times what our new lending is. 7 times. Now this is another one of those where I read even Zeihan, you know, when they get on their high horse about how the Chinese total debt, when you take private debt, et cetera, it's 250% of GDP. Wow. American is 350%. We got our own problems, folks. What's going to happen is, in this country, since we haven't dealt with Social Security, which could have been done easily with a few tinkering things at one time, and with the movement of those millennials, not millennials, excuse me, the Gen Xers up there, you're going to see interest rates go much higher. You're going to see taxes go much higher. They have to, Zeihan says they'll have to go up double. Think that doesn't change things? Think that doesn't change what you'd buy? So some people would say the entire Chinese system is subprime. Now let's look at this thing of what's going on between Trump and China right now for a second. For China, their shipments to the U.S., their exports, represent somewhere between 4 and 7% of their total economy. Our exports to China represent 1%. So who's got the leverage? If you're like China or Germany, you are beholden to outsiders. I mean, you exist because outsiders are willing to buy your product. Now, I don't know exactly what's intended. I think my own analysis is that Trump is still transactional. He's looking for a good deal. But there are people in the administration like Bolden and like the trade representative, pretty hard case people. And I'm not sure they're not trying to break China and using economic leverage to do it.
And who would benefit?
We would benefit in the sense that they wouldn't be a threat. But let me go on. There's more to this. If you'll hold the questions till the end, I'd appreciate it. China is the largest importer of everything. They've got to have everything shipped in. Food, you're talking about food, you're talking about, I don't mean they don't produce any, but they absolutely need food, they need fuel. And the U.S. made modern China. Isn't that the oddest thing? I have a book at home. I probably should have brought it. There was a Chinese city that came over and I hosted them, and they gave me a book about their city. And it was fascinating because the world started with 1984. That was when Deng Xiaoping and the people from Shanghai took over after Mao, and they began opening, playing to the game. The Chinese believe in free trade. They just don't practice it. That make sense? They know it works. They just don't want to do that. So I'm going to say a little bit about Japan. Among other things, after World War II, what we'd removed was the biggest threat to China, Japan. And the colonial powers. They're all gone. The only thing left is the U.S. Navy. It's hard to understand. Younger people, I fear, don't get what went on in World War II. That was the only war I've ever seen, I found these numbers myself, where the losers killed 7 times as many people as the winners. The Japanese killed tons of Chinese, Filipinos, others, and Germans. Everybody knows the German story. They've got all the press. But the Japanese killed 7 times as many people. I'll give you a quick anecdote, and I'm going to run over folks, way over. John. Just keep going? Okay. Well, the rape of Nanking, they killed something like 350,000 people. The only thing that saved 250,000 is 22 Europeans and Americans created a 1 square mile area and told the Japanese it's an international zone, you can't come in. It was Western arrogance, and the Japanese bought it. Okay? So, let's look out from China, and you'll see what they see. The north is now that way, okay? We flipped the map, and here's what the Chinese see. They see up here Japan, next South Korea, next Taiwan, and then the Philippines. Those are all allies of us. And their problem is, where do they get everything? Well, it's got to come through there. Those are the Malacca Straits, Singapore. That's why Singapore is such a busy thing. Does anybody have a laptop or a, what do you call them, tablet? If you do, Google ship map. That's all you have to do. There's a fascinating map from 2012, and it shows where all the ships in the world, the container ship, any kind of a freighter, was. And you can see where it's really bright. It'll be along the China coast. It'll be along the Malacca Straits, London, Belgium, Netherlands, New Orleans, Houston, that kind of thing. But you can actually see what's going on and do that. Because it's an interactive map, I couldn't get it to work here, but ship map, that's all you have to put in, and you can find it. Okay. Japan is insulated from any little battles here because their cities are on the eastern side. They're not on the western side. And they can ship down more through here and stay away through Indonesia and stay away from any bad stuff that happens. The Chinese, by the way, are trying to build a canal over here to get past the Malacca Straits. Understand what? All that stuff about the South China Sea, that's where they're building those bases, putting in islands. You see what that's all about? Okay. China has to get those things. Most of the oil coming out of the Middle East, if those straits are pinched off by the U.S. Navy or anybody else, they've got real problems. How do you get that stuff? In addition, the costs there are very high. Okay, I'm going to move to the Gulf for a minute. Well, there's Japanese demography. They're the worst in the developed world. Why do you think they were going for automation? No workers. That, and where do they build their plants? U.S. build it where there are workers, where you can sell the product, and you don't have to deal with that. This is the Middle East. I'm not going to take a lot of time on it, but over on this side, you've got Iran. Over on that side, Saudi Arabia, up there. If the U.S. pulls out, they're very likely they will go after each other. Iran is stronger, but Saudi Arabia might be able to hold them in the desert. Saudi Arabia, by the way, a third of the population ain't Saudi. And their fighters aren't Saudis. They're Pakistanis and others, their Air Force. I've met them. What they have is a whole bunch of U.S. equipment stored there. Their hope that the U.S. is going to show up and use it. So the United States has been in the Middle East to protect our partners, not us so much. We used to be importers, but now, 2 years ago, the U.S. became the top producer in the world. Within a year, we will be the top exporter in the world. That's a huge change. So we no longer have a direct interest in that area. We used to keep 2 carriers there all year. Now we're down to half a year, 1. If we pull out, that can blow. If that blows, that totally messes up Asia, Eastern Asia. Okay? Now you're going back. What Zeihan sees is that these people will go and act the way they did before we imposed this Peace America since 1945. Now, will they? I don't know, but that's the worry. Canada has one of those demographics that looks like the rest of the developed world, and it's a big problem for them. They sell their oil into the American Midwest, which is the lowest priced place to sell into. British Columbia trades more with us than they do with Canada. Canada bribed Quebec by transferring a huge amount of money to them every year. Who pays that? Alberta pays it. What does Alberta have? Alberta has oil and gas and other things. Alberta's per capita income is way higher than any U.S. state. But they're the ones being asked to pay for all that. And they don't like it. The second largest party now is a secessionist party. And the brilliant Canadian court, Supreme Court, has ruled secession is legal. That was for Quebec, okay? So there's a danger there. Canada has a real danger. If they lost in Alberta, where would Alberta go? Probably with us. British Columbia, possibly the same. Okay, Mexico. Now that's what a healthy demographic looks like. See how it differs from all the rest? Lots of young people. Their problem is they got awful geography. There are no rivers that flow to the sea, okay? And even places that aren't jungle, they're high desert. It's just a very tough place to grow anything. But they do have a large market and a large labor pool. And more important than anything else, they're in the right neighborhood. In 2014, there were 350 million legal crossings of the border. That's the most anywhere in history. And the bigger the labor cost differential, and there's a big one between there and the US, the more integrated those two economies become. You understand that? From both sides it matters. Right now they get about half their fuel from the US, and they're headed for buying 10 times as much as in 2010 from us and 4 times the natural gas. We're the supplier now, okay? So they're in pretty good shape. If the world gets nasty, if Europe is shrinking, I always knew this about Europe. I knew a lot of this stuff that Zeihan has before, but I didn't know all the pieces. I thought of Europe going in this nice kind of slow decay, you know, where you go in the house and the furniture's a little bit worn, you know. But it can be worse than that, because when those things start to happen in Europe, you get trouble. One of the things I was saying about the young people too is if you don't give young people jobs, it's not a good idea. In France, 20–30% unemployment. In Greece, over 50%. The one thing you never want to do is have unemployed young men. They're awful. They decide that there's something wrong with the world. It's the Jews' fault, it's the blacks' fault, it's somebody's fault that they're not successful. And it's a terrible mistake. So you try to avoid that. It's sort of like in some of these developing countries, they educate a bunch of people. Now they come back from Oxford or whatever, and they don't have any job, and there's something wrong with the system. Of course, that's the way it works. But this is a country that is going to do well because it's got the biggest market in the world right next door to it. And again, I say it will pass Russia. It's just a question of when in the next couple of decades that happens. Latin America, I'd always thought, just had bad political culture. Actually, it's geography. It's bad geography. You get coastal elites, then you get mountains or jungles with indigenous populations. Very hard to make anything work. You're going to have rich and poor. You're going to have huge differentials. If you try to build infrastructure through highlands, it costs 5 times as much. And that's almost all you've got to do. If you take a place like Caracas and the major population centers of Brazil, there's no road. Not one road that goes between those two. And it's very, very difficult. Again, the best place is down there in that Argentina area. Argentina is a wonderful story. You know, if the geopolitical strategists were right, policy doesn't matter. But that's not true. In 1920, Argentina was the 5th largest economy in the world. Pretty good. But by populism, fascism, socialism, they've managed to screw it up beyond belief. They have now a businessman as president who's trying to get them out of their mess, but they're basically bankrupt. If they ever can straighten it out, they've got everything you need. They do have a waterway where they can convey stuff. They do have good land. They're out of any of the danger zones. The Russians aren't going to invade them. The Saudis aren't going to invade them. The Chinese aren't going to invade them. So that's different. Shale is what changed everything for us and created a situation where we're now independent on almost everything. We don't need very much. That's South America again. If you look at mountains on the left, jungle for most of Brazil, and then this, I keep hitting the wrong button. Sorry. We'll come back to oil exporters back in 2015. See where it's coming out of? Largely Saudi Arabia in that area. Top oil exporters in 2020, that changed. We used to be importing a bunch of that stuff, now we're not. Break-even oil prices, this is what happened. Up here is what shale was in 2012, break-even full price cost. This is what it is now, or was in, what is this, 2016, something like that. So it totally changed the game. And American shale, what we get out of it, it's clean compared to very dirty out of Venezuela and some of these other places. Very hard to process. The American oil company spent a fortune trying to create facilities to process that dirty stuff. And then along comes shale. They got a huge investment and it's not needed, actually. Okay, immigration, I'm going to say a few words about. Oh, the Asia battle space. This was what I was trying to say before about having to come down here, get through those Straits of Malacca, and then the Chinese canal they're trying to build across Thailand there. On immigration, here's the problem. You can't create a 20-year-old for demographics. If you can get them to come, that's a pretty good deal if they're trained. If they're trained. That's why businesses and the chamber are always fighting for things like H-1B visas. We want trained, talented people. Because if you get a 20-year-old who's trained, you've saved $250,000. You didn't pay for the education. You get a person who's 30 or 40 years old, it's a little different deal. You've got them and they have talent, but they haven't paid in for Social Security and everything for all those years. So 20s are what you'd rather have. Immigration largely helps the federal government because they get revenues off of it. Locals, it costs because of things like schools. Local and state immigration is expensive for. But let's go back to demographics. In order to maintain the current population, you need 2.1 children per capable woman, okay? We have 1.77. That won't do it. You're going to have a decline in population if that's all you have. Decline in population, since that and productivity are the only things that matter to GDP, you're going to have GDP go down. So we've done it with immigration, but not in a very orderly or sensible way. The biggest threat to the U.S. is really, geopolitically, is drugs. And it's interesting because the drug cartels prey on the illegals because they can manipulate and use them. Okay. My own view, I'm not going to get into this, but better to provide some sort of temporary status. And my reason for that is I want to know who's here, and I want to sort them by who I want and who I don't want. And that would also hurt the cartels. Future, the problem is the success of our challengers is mainly due to the system we built. They've had economic miracles based on cheap capital, absolute freedom of the seas, and open markets. We know where the flashpoints are, but if something happened in the Middle East, because they could, both sides could hit the other's supply and production and shipping areas, okay? If that happens, U.S. oil might be $70 a barrel. World oil would be $150 or higher. So it would be very serious for them. If free trade ends, capital and credit are going to go plummet. Interest and mortgage rates probably into the teens. Dramatic increase in government spending for health and pensions. And in this new world, the U.S. is going to be the friend to have because we have market, we have capital, we have security, and we have trade protection. You want to be friends with somebody? We're the ones. And we drive a pretty hard bargain, by the way. Low-skilled work will move to Mexico and Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia has growing populations. That's one thing I disagree with Trump on. He should have made a deal for Southeast Asia because that's going to be a successful area over the next several decades. Demands for inputs will plunge. That'll hurt Brazil and Africa. U.S. assets will become more popular. There are only a few countries that will have, about 17, everything that you'd want. Here's a global stability map from 2015 to 2030, and you'll see sort of the usual suspects of Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, and some of Southeast Asia. By the way, Vietnam's an interesting thing because on a map that you'll see, or I have shown, that's nearly a U.S. ally. Why would they be a U.S. ally? We're not a threat to them anymore, folks. It's their neighbor who's the threat to them. Here's another political risk. These come from different sources. Does that look similar to the other one? Where the political risks are? Okay. And I look up economic freedom every year. It's one of the things I always study. Similar, where you have economic freedom, where those things work. Then dollar diplomacy. If we get disorder, if the rest of the world gets disorderly and we pull back, these are places where our money will make a difference, and they will need us. Latin America will need us on things like production of oil, etc. We have we not only have the money, we have the expertise. And then this is the consequence of what's happened over these 75 years. And this is world poverty. Now it's defined very, very narrowly. I mean, extreme poverty of about $1.50 a day, or now up to $2 a day almost. But you can see how dramatically it's dropped. China is the biggest one in that. 1 billion people out of extreme poverty. 1 billion. And here's another way to say it, because the other one only expressed the amount in poverty. The green are the people who aren't in extreme poverty. Okay? These are huge changes. So the question, it is perfectly sensible for an American to say, I don't want any part of that stuff. We can do what we need to do, we'll just stay home. That's not an illogical thing to say. The question is, what's going to happen with the rest of that world? Do you want to have to deal with it? I'll give you another example. There were some, well, let's do it quickly with the people who first came to see Trump. Heads of state. First one is Theresa May from UK. She knows going out of, with the Brexit, she's going to have to double the diplomats and their intel. They're building 2 carriers, super carriers, and they want to integrate them into our battle groups. Okay? Those were nice things to say. She also wants a free trade deal. We'll drive a terribly hard bargain. I know everybody here thinks we're softies. Not when we do trade deals. We're not. Trump, broke apart NAFTA. He wanted separate deals. He got one with Canada and then with Mexico. The Mexican one was fascinating because the previous president was the best we could ever hope for, and the new president is of Mexico. But he went to the guy who was leaving and said, make a deal with Trump and I'll get it passed. And they did. But we will drive a very hard bargain with the Brits. They'll get their free trade deal, but it will not be fun for them. The next was Abe, the head of Japan. Notice these are the 2 naval nations. These are the islands. Who are the first people to come see Trump? If we rule the sea. And Abe said, well, we'd like to invest $500 billion in the U.S. Is that going to make you happy? Trump said, yeah, but you're going to have to do your own defense. Now, I don't believe, neither do most people, that Trump would ever pull out of the Pacific. America has never allowed somebody to become the owner of the Western Pacific. I don't think that's going to happen. Okay? Then Merkel came, and she tries to explain. The German, I will explain to you how this works, and she does, and Trump barely stays awake through that. And she's telling him, these are the reasons not to do it, this is what it would do to us. She didn't bring anything. That didn't move the Donald at all. And then Xi from China came, and his message, it wasn't pleading and it wasn't threatening, it was just, don't pull the rug out. But I don't know that he had anything to offer. Okay? So which way is the world going to go? I don't know. The things I do know are that those demographics are absolute, nothing going to change that. So Europe is going to be in decline. Russia is in decline. Will it do something goofy? I mean, think of Russia now, I'm not talking about Putin, as kind of an aging drunk with nukes. That's not a pretty picture. You have to give credit to the Soviets and the United States. We went through that whole Cold War, 47 years, and they very carefully managed not to have a war with each other. Mao at one point went to the Soviets and said, would you give me some nuclear weapons? And the Soviets said, well, what are you going to do with them? He said, well, I'm having this war with the United States, and The Soviets said, you understand that hundreds of millions of people are going to die? And he said, it's just a pile of bodies. They went back and said, he's crazy. We're not giving him any nukes. Well, it's like the mafia. The mafia does not go out and do hits on federal prosecutors. There may be some random crazy who does that stuff, but they don't do that stuff. In other words, you don't start that war with the United States. China is a more interesting thing. If the Middle East thing comes, that could provoke things with China. This new president is clearly, he's made himself president for life. He's a nationalist. He is pushing, but I don't know for sure where they're going to end up. The thing about these one-man deals is they're so fragile. I remember people used to tell me the Soviets are going to pass us, and then it was the Japanese, and now it's the Chinese. And I'd always say, no, no, no. This has been going on for 50 years. I've been making this argument. You don't understand how fragile their systems are. I'd tell the people on the Soviets, all it takes is one guy to change. One. In our country, one guy changing doesn't do anything. Nothing. Doesn't matter. But for them, it does. And when Gorbachev came in, game over. It's over. So the same kind of thing could happen with China, but I don't predict things. One thing I'd leave you with is straight line projections. The farther they go, don't believe them. The reason is people do stuff to prevent them. People make decisions. They change things. Does that make sense to you? So you can't just assume that things are going to be that way. I'll stop. I ran 25 minutes over. That's all, John.
Theresa May, is she going to survive? And what in the world is the end game there?
It's almost impossible. EU just voted to give them a little more time. Here's the difficulty. With the EU, it takes all 28 countries to agree to a change, and they all want something different. Spain wants Gibraltar. Ireland wants the access across. How you can negotiate that in this kind of a time frame, it's virtually impossible. And in Britain, they know what they don't want, but they can't express what they want. Meaning you can't get a vote for something positive.
How would you start to address what you call the drug threat?
Well, I'm not sure that I am knowledgeable enough. We did pretty well when it was coming up to Miami and that kind of an area. I mean, we really hit them with our Coast Guard, et cetera. Most of it comes up through the cities and it's through trucking. It's not individuals so much. So there's technology and things you could address. I'd be pretty draconian on how I'd treat people who bring it in. I'm not going to be so nasty to some 18-year-old kid taking something, but I'd be pretty rough, I think, with the folks who did it. But there's a lot of technology to be done.
Is that a shale revolution, or is that a technology plus property rights revolution that we've had?
I'm sorry. Give me a little more. I'm not sure what
You referred to the shale revolution before. Is that really a shale revolution, or is it more a technology revolution plus land rights?
Oh, it's technology, because when it first started, it was pretty expensive to extract, but the technology was advanced so quickly. I don't think anybody saw it coming that fast. I'm not an expert on oil. There are people in the room around here who might know more than I do about that. But it was the technology. And the fact is, there are parts of the world who could do some production, but most of the talent is in the American majors. There are a couple of other companies around the world, but not many. Now, the interesting thing about shale, though, is the producers, that wasn't the big guys. It's the little people. And so their whole style is completely different.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim, for an excellent talk.
Thank you.
I was really surprised at how much population plays into the GDP. I wasn't quite aware of that, as you've made clear. Russia, in 1919, I think, started the world on abortion. They were the first country that legalized it, and I think we're kind of seeing the chickens come home to roost here. My question, though, is between Russia and Ukraine, what do you see, where's the end game for that dynamic, and where is that going to end up? It's not good right now. Part of Ukraine is considered a war zone even now.
Well, the Russians got the biggest thing they wanted. By taking the Crimea, they've essentially got their own aircraft carrier, and they can control that sea. They'd like to have more than that, and Ukraine is a mess. It's not terribly coherent. The other thing, let me see if I can explain, let me say a little more on that, because it applies to more parts of that area. When you start getting things going bad, people go, you create the far left and the far right, and things can get very hairy. That's, in Germany, you're now seeing more far right coming up. Merkel has already said she's leaving, but when she leaves, I'm not sure what Germany's going to look like. It may not be the Germany we've been used to. So in a place like Ukraine, it's terribly unstable. Most of their good fighters were actually Russians, and so that didn't help trying to take on the Russians themselves. A lot of them went over to the Russians, took the equipment over.
Mr. Tim Witsman.